Yeast. You can't brew without it. A single-cell microorganism that feeds on sugars, replacing them with alcohol and carbon dioxide gas to produce beer. And this is our yeast under a microscope. Some people say that Harvey's yeast bestows a quality to the beer that is unique, a fingerprint, as it were, that readily affirms the identity of the brewer. Whether you are drinking a mild, bitter, porter, whatever, the character of the yeast is discernible. It is, quite simply, Harvey's, and we have been using it for 60 years. I spent my childhood living alongside Harvey's Brewery. My father was head brewer, and I well remember the numerous deliveries that passed through the brewery gates. But the most intriguing were the copper churns that arrived each month and were spirited away into the brew house. They were the property of the British Pure Yeast Company and contained freshly propagated yeast from Burton-on-Trent. It was a service that many small brewers availed themselves of. You didn't know which brewery the yeast had come from, a closely guarded secret, lest some unscrupulous customer should approach the source of supply direct. We merely knew that through trial and error, it was fit for purpose. You asked for A, B, C, D, or E strain, and fresh, clean supplies arrived each month. Then, horror of horrors, the British Pure Yeast Company ceased to exist, taking with it its coded strains. Now, my father's generation of brewers had returned from wartime service with a sense of camaraderie. Commercial rivalry has never played a part in a hands-on brewer's philosophy. If a brewer has a problem, it is a shared problem. So it was that my father gratefully trialled yeasts from the Star Brewery Eastbourne, Tamplin's, and the Kemp Town Brewery in Brighton. But while those yeasts fermented perfectly well in those breweries, none had the attributes to ferment our brewing sugars or reproduce effectively at Harvey's. It would be no exaggeration to say he was on the point of despair when an analytical chemist who worked within the industry and was on holiday in Lewis paid a social call. Having shown his guest around the brewery, the two men found their way to the sample room, and in the course of conversation, my father mentioned his plight. It was suggested that he might approach the Tadcaster Brewery Company, as many brewers had found their yeast to be most satisfactory. When his guest departed, my father returned to this office and thumbed through his brewing directory. Tadcaster 2101. Good afternoon. My name is Jenner, Anthony Jenner. I'm head brewer at Harvey's Brewery in Lewis, in Sussex. We've been advised that your yeast does perform extremely well with other brewers, and we wondered if we too might put it to the test. Marvellous. So what time scale are we talking on? Well, we will put it straight into the brew on arrival, and we will keep our fingers crossed. Many thanks. As a result of that conversation, it was agreed that 30 pounds of yeast would be dispatched by the 9:56 p.m. passenger train from York on Monday, the 14th of October, and would arrive in Lewis at about midday on Tuesday, the 15th of October, 1957. He was told that if the yeast performed as it did in Yorkshire, he could expect to see 75% of the sugars fermented out. But it was essential that the brew was roused 24 hours after the yeast was pitched in. The yeast duly arrived and was pitched into the brew. The following morning, a healthy head was evident and fermentation was underway. That afternoon, the brew was roused. 2 days later, a heavy crop of yeast was skimmed into the wagon below and safely stowed in the cold room. Fermentation had run to form. It now remained to see if the resultant beer would condition and fine. And it did. It tasted good, it looked good, and it went out to trade. There were no complaints. The following week, the yeast was taken out of cold store and pitched into the next brew. And this process has been ongoing since that October day in 1957. With yeast, the mother cell buds during fermentation to produce a daughter cell. And this reproductive process is ongoing. Some 3,000 generations of yeast have passed through this fermenting room. My father maintained that it settled down to the Sussex air. It has survived 2 floods, the vagaries of 60 harvests, and several varieties of malting barley. As we say in Sussex, she's a good old girl.